Rippity-doo, rip-a-beep-a-boo, scoobity-boop, scoobity-boop, rip-beep-beep-beep, doobity-boop, deebity-babity-boobity-boo, scoobity-bop-boop, beep-bop-boop, scoop-a-doop, beep-bop, scoopity-boop, boopity-doop, doop-doop-doop, scoop-dop, doopity-doo. Hello. I'm just laying down some fire tracks. I'm plugging in the phone to the laptop because I've heard that makes the sound better, especially on the YouTube, so hopefully it does. Fingers crossed. I'm going to do this from now on. And if that works, I'll be happy. Folks, I'm soy facing. We love to do it, don't we? We love it. I want to kiss you guys. I want to do the soy face when I kiss you. And the boys, the guys, and the girls. Many people told me that at that rally he just was doing my impression of him, and damn it, they're right. So many people have said that I do a bad impression of Trump. And I'm telling you, I do Trump at his most concentrated and condensed, which means once in a while he's gonna like hit the top of the meter, you know? He's gonna what's the term in acoustics? When you blow out, he's gonna blow out the top of the key, and then he's gonna sound like me. Then he's gonna go, I want to kiss the guys. I want to kiss them. I want to give out the big kiss because I'm immortal. Folks, I drank the mercury. I did it. I followed the golden path to the mercury concoction, and now I'm the immortal emperor. Folks, we love to see it. I've got an emperor, and I've got an army. I've got a beautiful terracotta army. And guess what, folks? They're going to rule the world on my behalf, because I'm the emperor, the immortal one. And I've got immortal terracotta warriors. And guess what, guys? I'm going to live forever. Yeah. He literally thinks he's immune now, even though we're not even sure that there's any long-term immunity provided by infection, because we've already got because I know a number of months ago there were a spate of reinfection cases in South Korea that eventually turned out to be just failures to have like accurate testing, essentially. Like they tested, it was two false, it was like a positive and a false positive or something like that. But in this case, it looks like we've got at least two confirmed reinfections, including one of a woman who died. I mean, she was very old, but still, folks, it's not great. It's not great. I do have the tightest pussy in the 5 boroughs. So instead of accepting that reality, he has instead concocted a reality where he is immortal now and immune, and his blood could probably be synthesized. And if we could make people say, how do you get the Trump people to take a Trump vaccine or any vaccine? Just say that you made it with Trump's blood. If Trump says that his blood is going into a vaccine, everyone would take it. And you know what? It would probably give us, what it would do is, even if it was total placebo, it would essentially reorient our understanding of disease and reality to such an extent that we would actually cure COVID, but by essentially redefining COVID out of existence. Like over time, like we would still have the deaths and we would still have the sicknesses, but we would just break up the apparatus for even recognizing it, which was always the basis for Trump's COVID policy. Don't test, because you get tests, you get positive results, so you don't want that. And you could make that a reality by simply defining the disease out of existence. And if you say, well, that's going to lead to things like, lots of people going to the hospital, maybe the capacity won't be there. Well, one thing is you direct resources to building capacity to deal with these increased deaths, but the increased deaths lose the urgency of corona. They lose the patina of exception, and they reestablish a normal baseline, where now we have X number more deaths a year from this infectious disease, but it is not coronavirus. And that means everyone's back to work, and everybody's back maskless, and there's no social distancing, and everybody just lives their lives. with a slightly higher risk of dying or getting a long-term neurological disorder or long-term lung damage. It just becomes a new normal. The way cancer rates going up over the years is something people accept. Hey, you're getting older. The price of that is you might get cancer. You know, you got older, the price of that is you might get this thing, or whatever we're calling it. And honestly, that's the most realistic thing we could do. If we wanted to be pure realists about this moment, like we're going to strip everything of morality, we're going to strip it of even like recognize, even evaluating from a political perspective. Like, let's say we're not even going to try to wring any political juice out of the failure of COVID and say, oh, look, you know, COVID is capitalism's fault. And we don't want to let capitalism off the hook. But if we recognize that there's nothing elucidating about this moment and that the COVID moment has no revolutionary potential, we could just say, okay, fine. We'll do this, because then at least you could fucking get back to like a functioning system and restart the economy in a meaningful way. And deal with, like, because otherwise this is an intractable problem. Having a system set up that has no capacity to do the things like wide-scale test and tracing capability and lockdown capability, most importantly, the kind of things that would be facilitated by massive suspension of rent, massive suspension of mortgage payments, complete suspension of all debt collection of any kind, mass infusion of direct cash payments to people to obviate the need to engage in the service economy and go outside of the home, and allow for large-scale lockdowns around areas of infection that were tested rigorously. That would be wonderful. Who's going to do that? You think Joe Biden's going to do that? We're talking about the realistic solution to this. It's just redefining it out of existence and adding it to the perils of life, the way that we went from 0 people getting killed every year in car accidents to 50,000 getting killed every year in car accidents. That is a 50,000% increase, I believe. And it's not a thing that we think of as a crisis. It's a thing we manage. And it'll be another thing we manage. And of course, that will disproportionately fall on the poorest among us. People least access to healthcare, least able to take off from work, least able to even be aware of this threat. The least, basically, people who are forced by the market to risk their lives more than they previously were. Yeah, that's awful. The only thing that's going to prevent that from happening is an intervening political movement, some sort of political organization that interrupts this process, that puts the fucking broomstick into the spokes of the machine. That's the only thing that's going to stop us from sliding towards that outcome. And of course, maybe we get a vaccine. Maybe we get a vaccine. And then everybody can just act like, you know what? Guess what? And here's the thing. Trump wins. Let's say hilariously Trump wins, which not outside of the realm of possibility at all. I'm not going to say in any way Joe Biden has this thing rocked up. I think he'll probably win. But my God, I certainly have more... I would be much less surprised, I'll admit. I'll be way less surprised if Trump wins than I was that he won the first time. That was genuinely shocking. I'll admit, I was out to lunch like that on that one with a bunch more coastal elites. We weren't close enough to the ground, and if you want to ever own me by saying you didn't see Trump coming, even though you could listen to us talking about that fucking election and talking ourselves over and over again right to the precipice of recognizing that, holy shit, he's the man for this moment. He's going to win this thing. He's the one who makes sense in this context. Everything about, like, if politics is a game show, if politics is a spectacle, then he should win. But no, it's not that much of a spectacle yet. There's still a grounding. There's still a reality. There's still fence posts. And then we found out, nope, no. That firmament you thought there was totally rotted away. So I could fully admit that it could happen again. And I'll be way less surprised if it does. But man, if Trump wins, and then like halfway through his term, after he like loses big in this House and Senate again, and gets impeached again, and ignores it again, then we get a vaccine, and then he like leaves office. He's like this decrepit ball, like this like dehydrated but also wet sack of like Ron Popeil rotisserie meat, bright orange, just sliding allegiously out of the fucking fronts of the White House. Just go, I said it would go away magically. I said one day it would be gone, and look, it is. It's gone. Look, It's gone now. I said it. I said it. You heard me say it over and over again. Then eventually one day, like magic, it'd be gone. And now it's gone. Because for Trump, it is only the moment it is in. Past does not exist only as a vague memory that you have shaped into a fucking mirror of a delusional mirror of yourself, putting yourself in this position of fantastical command of the moment, when in reality you're a fucking moron who is barely aware of what's going on around you. Oh man, they see that apparently Eli Lilly was doing trials on, oh no, Johnson & Johnson, which I was surprised by. I thought they made like soap and shit. I guess they're also a pharmaceutical company. They were doing a trial vaccine and they had to stop the trial because of an unexplained illness or an unexpected illness. Either way, you don't want to hear that word before illness. And I just thought, I am legend, Will Smith. They create this vaccine that's going to immunize you from cancer, and then cut 6 months later, half the population are these horrible CGI zombies, vampires running around. And of course, there's the question, and I don't think anyone has ever answered to my satisfaction, but I haven't asked that much, I'll admit. What about this possibility that COVID just keeps evolving and becomes like the flu, where every year there's a new strain? There's a COVID-20, there's a COVID-21, there's a COVID-22, with all different lethalities that are like pegged around COVID lethality and require a new vaccine before you've even created one for the original COVID. No, I'm sure that happens all the time, but it was just the word unexpected illness that made me think, oh God, we've created a new mutant that's going to take over. It's Captain Trips. All the time has come down. Feel the power. Seasons don't fear the reaper, or the wind or the summer rain. It's so funny that they're doing The Stand right before this hit, and now they're going to release it. Hey guys, I guess they're thinking that now that everyone has basically decided that it's over, even though it's still happening and happening more and more, really, and that the trend lines are up and that you're reaching like early outbreak levels of daily infections and deaths now. We're, like I said, it's just we're all grinding down the emergency in our minds so we can keep going because we're just sick of sitting here. We're acting like, yeah, it's basically gone, and now we can look back and like, oh wow, we're lucky that didn't happen. Ha 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 ha. Now things are great. I can do socially distanced drinks, in front of the bar downtown, which it just feels so much like hanging out. And, it's like this is not a shadow of my former enjoyment and my former social life. This is just the new version of that, because we've normalized it into reality. We've manifested it into being. Okay, so someone's saying that it's more stable than the flu and less likely to do that. That'd be good. That'd be good. All right, that's nice. That means you could actually get a vaccine that could stamp it out relatively quickly. That's good. And then, of course, we would look back at that time and learn nothing of any meaning. All we will be is dumber from having lived through it. Dumber and deafer and more distracted and more agitated and more knee-jerk in our reactions and more either plugged out of politics to the point of nihilistic self-destruction or plugged into politics to the point of just cripplingly neurotic, nearly erotic fixation on the ups and downs of the spectacle of politics. Either way, not in any way better positioned to deal with the horrors of the world around us and the crisis, the continuing and folding crises. It's like Harrison Bergeron, where the smart people are forced to just have like a siren go off next to their head every 10 minutes, so that they can't think too far ahead before getting disrupted. We're all in that, and then we're going to be in worse situation. Monopoly capital will be in a vastly better situation because monopoly capital has monopolized the shit, taken the opportunity of this corruption. This drop in the economic, like because one of the things hurting, there's a drive towards monopoly and capitalism, but there's also, expanding wealth and inflation through that, which makes it harder for capital to, subsume others because they're able to grow in relationship to them. But in a situation like this, when you have whole sectors cored out almost overnight, monopoly capital can scoop those up and add them into the fucking Borg. So we're going to have a more monopolized capitalism than we've had since the fucking robber baron days, if we don't already. And it'll be something. A lot of mom and pop shops are going to get turned into like. I was not even something like like McDonald's or other things. Not even, more like they'll still be run by individual families and stuff, but as sort of like an Uber model, like a gig economy for restaurateurs, where like you get to rent out the place and get like a per hour salary with no benefits to like basically run a restaurant instead of actually getting the profits from the restaurant. Like that would be the new model. Franchises, but where like you're not even the owner, like they've already been doing that. There's a very interesting article a number of years ago now about 7-Eleven owners and how 7-Eleven has essentially proletarianized their ownership in large degree because there's these networks of like immigrant networks, mostly in India, that basically hook people who want to move to the United States from India up with franchises when they get there, sort of as their stake, like as dowries even. And that puts them in like sort of a subservient position, vis-a-vis this huge company that can do things like, schedule ICE raids on their own fucking franchisees if they're thinking of, asking too many questions. But they like squeeze the owners to the point where many of them make like $20,000 a year, even though they're spectrally supposed to be the franchise owners. And they'll just wholesale replace the entire, business model of small restaurants. I'd say restaurants and bars is number one because those are the ones that have been hardest hit. But anything subsidiary to that, escape rooms, shooting ranges, anything that it is a service or entertainment, recreational industry, or food or consumption or beverages, any of that element of life that involves people operating out of like fixed brick and mortar positions, like fixed capital. That's not going to be owned by individuals anymore. And that class of petty bourgeois is going to be subsumed into the proletarian class, which of course is what the engine of capitalism does. It's separate. You have a bunch of different classes embedded within capitalism. Like I have said, there's even pre-capitalist modes sticking in there. I, as I have said, am an artisan. That is a pre-capitalist class configuration. Doesn't exist it is not being produced by capitalism like hegemonically now. Like it was something that had to be subsumed within capitalism and broken up, and largely it's gone. What used to be artisans are 99% of the time their jobs are now proletarianized. I am a remaining artisan. I'm still in there, but the process is there are fewer over time until you grind out. And then you've got like things like the small bourgeois, and the PMC, whatever kind of pseudo class you want to pull out of your ass, they will over time be pulled apart. Some of the lucky ones will get pulled up into the ownership class. The losers will get pushed down into the working class, the proletariat, and then you end up with just two. And this is going to be furthering that process hugely. The question is whether that's actually helpful to the radicalization of the working class. The old idea was it would, because it would create larger and larger concentrations of working class people who shared working class conditions, shared exploitation, shared an understanding of their alienation and the contributors to it, and could organize that way, become a class for themselves with a counter-hegemonic political and cultural engine. That's what. When the battle of positions that Gramsci talks about is between capitalist hegemonic cultural institutions, cultural and civic institutions, and an emergent generated working class generated counterculture of its own institutions. And like post-war Italy is the closest example in the world to that concept. Because the Communist Party during the post-war period, when it was the official opposition many of the time and was being suppressed by the Gladio operation, had its own civic institutions, its own radio stations, its own media apparatus, its own political leaders, mayors, senators, and cooperative aid organizations, civic organizations, recreational organizations. That's also true of the German Social Democratic Party before before the Nazi rise. That's what the concentration of the working class, the pulling of people more and more into the working class does, is because there will always be more working class people than there are capitalists, which means over time, as there are more and more capitalist workers relative to capitalists, that counter hegemony becomes stronger. The self-organizational capacity of the working class as such gets greater, and then eventually you're able to, through the force of arms and persuasion, any element that comes along with being both most numerous and most organized. It can't be one or the other. If you're organized without numbers, you will be crushed. If you have numbers but there is no sufficient organization along sufficient concepts, which comes from creating institutions, counter-hegemonic institutions, that's the durability that allows you to point your movement in the right direction, to find the crack in the fissure of capitalism and drive into it. You need that, and the problem is that while we are seeing before our eyes that this process of stripping all class character down to just two defining categories is happening and accelerating, there is no concomitant rise of working class, self-conscious, counter-hegemonic institutions and culture. And that's because of the effect that the process of social atomization, suburbanization, racial polarization, and nationalism have done to, and then compounded and quadruple compounded and compounded beyond words, compounded into the brain of a supercomputer, the fucking internet. On top of all of that, has led to a situation where even though more and more people are turning into working class, they're not thinking of themselves as working class. They're just thinking of themselves as someone fallen from a natural social position. That's the full phenomenon of the PMC who don't actually make money, right? Somebody who is not thriving in the accredited world where you learn from your middle class parents that you get a college education and that allows you a certain social standing, self-conception, and salary, and you don't get the salary, but you still think of yourself first and foremost as part of that class, that cultural class of college-educated people who are urbane and cosmopolitan and value, social inclusion as ends into themselves. The refinements that come from accrediting oneself to the bourgeois morality that late capitalism demands. Even though they are now functionally, more and more of them, actually working class in their relationship to capitalism, they are, nonetheless, not imagining themselves that way. And think of those Trump-supporting, non-college educated white men who are his base, who are his fucking mujahideen, his Fedayeen warriors, his 300 Spartans. Some of them are of course, just racist, right? A lot of them are just I like racism, but a lot of the reason that they're racist is because in America, race is only really examined critically if you're white through the crucible of that bourgeois accreditation into middle-class morality. That is really the only interaction a white person in America gets socially. Forget the television and all the stuff you see on the globalist media. In reality, what really brings you towards these, not lived values, I'm talking just things in your head, things that cost nothing to feel, like white guilt and white privilege and the idea of white supremacy, it does, and your need to fight it and things like that, and your sense of white responsibility for the position of African Americans in this country. That's the specific shit you get from going to fucking college. So some of it is just race hate, but other of it is misdirected rage due to the fact that you're, even relative to the rest of, you're in a working class, even relative to your older generations before you or other people you see around you in culture and on the television, your life is getting worse and worse. But you don't know how to define that. You can't define it because no one is talking to you from the other level. All media is the fucking people who went to college talking to each other. And everyone else is just drowning, and they're just sitting on top of this drowning barge going, oh, it's so sad they can't free themselves. And they're yelling across this chasm, but it's all loaded with contempt, and it's all loaded with like the alienness. Like, you're essentially talking to people who you don't understand. You're condescending, even with the best of intentions. And you combine that with the fact that there's no lived reality of class in this country. People don't live class, especially in the gig economy world where people aren't working in those conditions of like a factory line. I mean, even like I'd say our best hope for mass organization in this country are the few places where people do work together, like big box retailers or Amazon fulfillment centers. And there are still factories in this country, god damn it, too. And also people like postal workers and teachers. Like that's hopeful because it's where people work together. But most people don't work together. They're hustling. They've all turned us into lumpen proletarians even though we have jobs. And the thing that's like, so I think people argue over these questions, and it's like at every point you can see how the category confusion is happening and how they basically don't really even disagree. They just have decided that arguing over this constitutes some sort of meaningful engagement for them, or recreation, or a combination of the two. But man, it just, if you pull this apart, there's no resolving it either way. Like, this is a real conflict. Oh, and also, I forgot, there's another section of the non-college Trump supporters who are the beautiful boat people, because yes, there are a lot of upper and what those people are I'm saying, it's like the class is getting pulled, like the fucking Velcro is getting pulled. Well, some get pulled down, some get pulled up, and they're getting pulled up. And the reason they're voting for Trump is because that's a class interest for them. All the cultural stuff is just gravy. And the reason they both feel that way is because we are culturally segregated. Our culture does not, we live it through much more through the prism of race than through class. And as I've said a million times, the only hope we have is that the conditions as they evolve will provide opportunities for us to grab in front of us the possibility of reversing these trends and grabbing people together and having them pull in the same direction to interdict with the slide we're having towards total monopoly domination. And I don't think it's lost. I don't think we're doomed. I just think that we have to accept that we're at a more basic level. We're fighting at a more basic level than a lot of us want to be, because the implication of that is that, man, we have so far to go. But, acceptance is the first step towards moving forward. And I feel like a lot of us are just fighting through this Kubler-Ross cycle. Like, we stay in the discourse and fight it because we're fighting that eventual, inevitable realization that these fights are for no good reason. And then we will, when human voices wake us, till human voices wake us. I did not hear the Miss Rebel thing from John Brown. I was watching it. I had the titles on. She said, if those rebels find out about that, you'll get hanged. She was talking to Missouri red shirts, ruffians, who were essentially almost all of them deputized into various militias that were part of the United States government's recognized territorial legislature in Kansas. Were they rebels? Who were they rebelling against? I've not read Under the Volcano. I've heard it's good, though. The chat is full of artisans, I'm sure. 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 No, they were not called rebels. Why would they have been called rebels? They were called border ruffians. Generally, that was what they were called. And in like the press and stuff, there was also like a political movement that was like called the Party of Law and Order. But nobody called them rebels. They weren't rebelling against anyone. They were enforcing. They were enforcing what was the closest thing to a legitimate monopoly of violence in the Kansas Territory, according to Uncle Sam. And the reason that matters is because to misstate that is to misstate the position that Brown found himself in, and the need to transgress, to need to break out of the strategic stalemate that had arisen, where neither side was willing to take the next step, which over time benefited the larger political momentum behind the slave state coalition there, the Missouri faction. The ones who ended up writing the Lecompton Constitution, even though their election was invalidated and they were not a recognized government, they still fucking passed and demanded that Congress approve a constitution that accepted slavery as the law of the land in the new Kansas state. And it was whether or not the Democratic Party would support that constitution that led to the Southern Democrats walking out at the convention in Baltimore in 1860, which led to the Northern Democrats nominating, the remaining Northern Democrats nominating Stephen Douglas, the Southern Democrats nominating for themselves John Breckinridge, some radical centrists around in the Clay tradition put a guy named John Bell as the compromise can't we all get along candidate, the cuck. And it was all over the Lecompton Constitution, because that was the bridge that was too far even for the dough faces. Because Stephen Douglas was, by any respect, he was the next logical guy in line after David Pierce and Buchanan. He was the most prominent congressional dough face. The guy who fought Lincoln in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates over the issue primarily of slavery and his vehement defense of it, and defense of the planter prerogative in even foreign policy. But the thing is that around Stephen Douglas, Northern sentiment changed. It was no longer possible in the North to say, just give it to him, like it used to be. Because even Northern Democrats, the guys who mostly said, leave slavery alone, I care about the banks, I care about the dang banks, and I care about the revenuers, and I don't give a shit about what these dainty doily motherfuckers, these Quaker weirdos in Boston, these homos, say about slavery. What's it got to do with me? Do you want those black people up in here? I don't, whatever. But they saw slavery as a threat the more they saw slavery as a competing threat to them, a competitive economic system that could realistically put them in a position to lose their market power, either as a farmer or as a laborer of any kind, because they'd be competing with literal free labor. They said, nope, this is a bridge too far, because the Lecompton Constitution was, if they accept this, then Kansas is a slave state in the Union with 2 new senators, breaking the balance in the Senate, and meaning with a Democratic president, because Democrats had a lock on the Electoral College at that point, especially with the Whigs imploding, and the Republicans, this brand new party that had just emerged, that had only had one presidential candidate. Up to its credit, the adventurist self-promoter John C. Fremont. They had to go with a celebrity just to get people's attention. But boom, second time they have this. It still would have fallen to a unified Republican Party or a unified Democratic Party, and that unified Democratic Party would then be voting to put slavery in every state. And once it's in every state that surrounds the North, how long before it has to be introduced there to keep moving, to keep pushing forward, to keep allowing a new area for slavers to import slaves and create a new market that creates demand for older slaves, older lines of slaves. By 1860, most northern the Virginia slave trade was mostly about breeding and selling slaves down to the big cotton plantations in the South, because that tidewater had been sort of already farmed out by the over aggressive farming of cash crops like tobacco. But you had this huge human capital stock that had to go somewhere, and if you foreclose that if you draw if you end that process of expansion, that's the end of the fucking system over time. And they understood that, which is why they pushed forward. But northern whites understood it too, and they didn't want to be competing. And so even Douglas had to draw a line at Lecompton, and that helped lead to Lincoln winning, and that then guaranteed the Civil War. And so it was the Kansas War, more than anything, that sharpened the sectional crisis to the breaking point, which needed to happen for slavery to end. And what did it? It was Kansas and then Harper's Ferry. And I'm just saying that means if that strategic context where you go from a situation where it looks like slavery is about to get ready to just chomp on and get its jaws around the neck of free labor in the North, to the hinge reversing, and then the final confrontation, which leads inevitably, thanks to the superior industrial capacity and population and organizational abilities of the North, to Northern victory and to the end of slavery as it had to be. And the funny thing is that you could really argue that the Civil War is essentially it's the war between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians in its final form. Like if you want to, like, if you look at it as an ideological conflict, like forgetting the fact that this is all just a cultural description for a material process, which is the development of parallel economic systems. Plantation-based agriculture in the South, slavery-based agriculture in the South, and free labor and smallholding in the North, or free manufacturing labor and smallholding yeoman farmery in the North. They produce completely competing and different cultures. The fact that the majority of the peasantry of the northern states was made up of smallholders who lived on their own land and farmed their own land, right? It meant that they created they also were able to produce surplus produce. They would be able to, most of them, if they were successful, and there was a lot of, the northern land wasn't rich enough to do big plantation agriculture, especially in New England, but there was enough land that individual smallholders could farm enough food to sustain their families and then surplus to sell. And what would they do? They would essentially exchange surplus crops for finished mechanical and material items, like pieces of clothing, manufactured items, things for the farm, industrial, the basis of an industrial economy, basically. And that transmission belt created a civic society around it. Now in the South, the proletariat largely was enslaved labor who produced only enough food for themselves. Like plantations had, like all slaves had to essentially, they were their own yeomen in that they farmed and they contributed to the farming of the food that fed themselves, but otherwise they spent all of their time working for the plantation owner, meaning that there is no surplus for them to exchange in the cities for finished products. So the demand that created like the industrial economy and the urban life of the North was impossible in the South. And so because of that, you essentially had a Federalist country and a Jeffersonian country. Like those two competing philosophies of government that emerged from the reality of the end of the American Revolution was now reduced to a real proposition because of the fate of geography, because of the fact that there was so much rich soil that allowed for the creation of these vast, profitable agricultural operations that could create huge surplus amounts of cash crops that could provide the material basis for formulating industrial capitalism in northern United States and also Great Britain. You know, it provides the fuel for the capitalist machine. They had like all those linen mills in Manchester were spinning, for a lot of the part of it, slave linen, slave cotton. And because the Jeffersonian idea of American liberty that we live with is essentially the idea of living as a farmer. Now, Jefferson thought he meant small yeoman farmers, but in reality, that's not possible without creating cities. Like, you can't have yeoman farmery the way they had in the North without creating the urban culture and urban infrastructure of things like banking and finance and like abstracted, essentially intensified capitalist productive relationships. Those things are united. You can only have continuing agricultural life if there is no excess, no surplus built up. And the way to do that is through slavery. Because he is imagining agrarian life through the lens of a slave owner, not a yeoman. He was a slave owner, not a yeoman. So when he idolized urban life, he was idolizing his experience. Now, because the fact people like him were the people who made up the political aristocracy, the leadership of the new country in the South, over time their institutions became the institutions of Jeffersonian democracy. Meanwhile, in the North, the absence of large tracts of rich land that could accommodate slave agriculture, the fact that the relatively rocky soil of the North was more conducive to smallholding peasantry. Also, the new territories of the North, even if they were richer in land, were also more deeply filled with Native Americans who had to be contended with, and much more, would require much more investment to just clear for any kind of large-scale agriculture at all. It was largely wilderness. So those two modes come into conflict in the Civil War. Finally, they cannot be resolved. And then instead of recognizing, but the problem is that, of course, that victory by Northern capitalism would eventually result in a synthesis between the two. It's not going to be just the destruction of the one. That's impossible. The problem is that the new thing we created, because of the results of Reconstruction specifically, was misshapen, essentially. Its historical form bent that Jeffersonian model of endless expansionary freedom maintained, and now sits unhappily in conjunction with like this attempt to build something like a rationalized, social democratic capitalist edifice. It's a bummer, man. It's a real bummer. But the whole point is that those crisis moments they're fluid. And we had a bad run of things. Like Lincoln getting shot was very bad. I don't know how much better things would be if he hadn't died, but man, I'm willing to say they would have been in some way better, which at this point a little bit could go a long way. The way things ricochet, the way things amplify over time and space. It's a bummer though. But yes, like the entire American conception of freedom was Jefferson's idea of limitless farming, like the idea that you don't have to have all that icky, complicated stuff. That's socially, that stuff that requires you to subsume yourself into a social collective. Even if it's like we can say that we're not talking about socialism. We're talking about capitalist market exchange. Yes, but capitalist market exchange, remember, is more progressive than what is Jefferson's essentially feudal worldview. And so he gets this feudalized capitalism because, it was a part of capitalism. Slave agriculture was part of capitalism. All those fucking big, all those huge plantations in the South were fueled by finance capital. They were all mortgaged to the hilt. They were all financial instruments. They sold fucking stock. They were integrated into every level of the world, the burgeoning world capitalist economy. But they had this feudal remnant structure based around these Jeffersonian ideas. And we did not crush enough that idea of American liberty when the North won the Civil War. That was the main failing, not crushing it enough. And I think, like I said, it wouldn't have been fully crushed because you don't do that. There was always going to be some level of accommodation that leads to a synthetic thing, not just the dominance of one. That's a dialectical. That's basic. You can't argue otherwise. But we certainly could be in a different position vis-a-vis that idea. And really, I think the real the dagger in the heart to our progress has been that the Constitution itself was not destroyed. Because the Constitution was what got us into that fucking mess in the first place. And the same way that the Articles of Confederation reached a point where they were no longer sustainable, and we started over from scratch, the Civil War should have been the thing that had us start over from scratch on a governing document, which would have put us on, yes, still capitalist, but on a track towards an actual industrial capitalism that had a social relationship at its base that accepted liberal subjectivity, which is equal subjectivity, which would have removed racism as a mystifying and socially atomizing and counter-revolutionary force in American life. And so the fact that we're still dealing with the Constitution, it's still this noose on our neck, it really is the thing, that moment stands out as the thing that warped our behavior. We're like a bound foot from a Manchu, bed maiden. It's a bummer. It wouldn't have made miracles happen. My God, I'm just saying we would be in a better position now than we are. That's all I'm saying. How much better? I don't know. I'm just saying we'd be in a better position. We would not have Trump as president. We would not be in this specific dilemma. I think we would have more durable and vibrant working class institutions in this country. We would have a more left-wing government. Even if things had gotten worse after the 70s, even if you have the same basic structure of a post-war boom followed by a collapse of the world order and then a reorientation around global finance capitalism that led to the end of American industrial dominance and its replacement in the supply chain with cheaper labor in the emerging East, and the America becoming instead the buyer of last resort, the surplus absorber within the capitalist system to maintain its military might overseas and to provide the mouth at the center of it to absorb all surplus production to regulate exchange. Even if that had happened, we would be in a better position. We'd probably have universal health care. Let me just say that. We would probably fucking have it. And we would not be in the situation where we are essentially biting our brains out of our head as a culture and driving ourselves insane because of our civic belief in freedom coming from this freakish, perverted, bewigged, aristocrat, sex criminal, Epstein-ass fucking slave owner, Thomas fucking Jefferson. The fact is that when we reach back to our most cherished American ideas of freedom, they don't belong to medieval peasants. In Europe, anyway, when people think of freedom, obviously more and more they're thinking in terms of, atomized American freedom, freedom to consume, the freedom of the market. Sure. But at the base of that, they also have a folk understanding of freedom that flows from the peasant solidarity that came before capitalism, because these things don't go away. They echo. The nightmares of all dead generations lay on the brain of the living. We, on the other hand, when we think of freedom, even I think on the left, we end up at Jeffersonian freedom to expand. Freedom, because that's the thing about the Jeffersonian idea, and the reason that it foundered finally on its inability to expand itself, because it cannot be stabilized within a system. It demands always, it can only compensate with more, because you're not giving people a social structure. The hostility to the state at the center of Jeffersonianism is the hostility to being integrated into a social situation. You're saying the fact that I, unlike my peasant or aristocratic European forefathers, were bound by superstition and stultifying social conventions in Europe and the vile hand of Roman papistry or whatever the fuck. Now here we can breathe free in the open spaces, but that means that we have to do it by ourselves, because to participate to allow ourselves to be brought into a social relationship is to undermine our freedom of movement. And freedom of movement here is defined as the only freedom that matters, as opposed to a deeper understanding of freedom as the freedom from fear, really, and pain that comes with a social awareness and social reciprocal obligation. That there is a meaning there and a richness to life that compensates for any narrow reduction of the aperture of like indulgence. And that what that means is that the only answer to social friction in those situations has to be expansion. There can be no resolution because there aren't institutions that people agree upon that can arbitrate distinctions. And so it leads, all questions have to be answered by expansion. And so what really healed the Civil War breach between the North and South? The whites of the North and the whites of the South, after we decided that we were going to solve the problem, the emergent social problem of emancipation, by just reinscribing slavery as much as we could in social form, if not in like technically economic relationship. We invaded fucking Spain, or we invaded Spanish Caribbean and fucking Philippines in the Spanish-American War. We consecrated that with expansion into becoming a world power. And then there was some battle within about that, but by the end of World War II, we had the whole world. And then space, and we always had this reach. And it was not until the Iraq War, I think, really, that the curtain closed. And now we're turning inward, and we're taking this Jeffersonian notion of freedom and individuality and liberty and what it means to be an American, and how that relates to, you know, a morality. How being American is part of a moral framework that involves Christianity, certainly, and as Protestantism, all that shit. It all flows. But that requires expansion, requires somebody getting some of this pie at every point. Because there's no other way to reduce social friction. And now, how are we going to reduce it when that is the presiding ideology of government? And we have this fucking noose around our neck in the form of the U.S. Constitution, smothering any chance of us breaking free of this wild thrashing death as we paroxysm our way through the fucking Kubler-Ross cycle, realizing that our social body must die if it cannot continue to expand. You guys know about, you know why some of these answers are purple highlight? I don't know why that is. I gotta say, as much as I'm sure I'll hate Hamilton, and as much as I hate the concept of the whole thing, I do think if you want to talk hero and villain, if you're talking Hamilton and Jefferson is the bad guy. I'm sorry. And the thing is that there will always be moments in American history where the Jeffersonian tradition has very worthy exponents who are doing good things to check the rise of horrifying monopoly capitalism, unchecked capitalism. I'm just saying that it was an insufficient antithesis to the thesis of Hamiltonian developmentalism. You know what I mean? Or maybe it's because it was the thesis. When we never broke through, we never broke over it, because there was always free real estate. Always free real estate. Free real estate made us, in every critical moment, able to vent off instead of confront within. Because in Europe, those fucking kettles started popping because there was nowhere for the pressure to go. In America, there was always somewhere for the pressure to go. And to me, that's the answer to every question about why America is exceptional, why it didn't have a labor party. It all boils down, however you want to talk about the functions, you want to talk about the fucking social expressions of it, the political expressions of it. It boils down to that law of fucking thermodynamics. So if it's like, if you want to broadly go progressive, regressive figure, the progressive figure is Hamilton, the regressive figure is Jefferson. And I would say that just on a personal level, even though Hamilton was a creep and an and kind of, and obviously an arch capitalist psycho, who feared and had nothing but fear and disgust for the idea of a common man, was still better than that hypocritical, fucking snot-nosed. Just he's the guy Boswell talked about when he said, "Why do we hear why must we hear the loudest bleating for freedom from the drivers of Negroes?" That's who he was talking about. Fucking Jefferson. And the guy immediately, even though he had said that there should be no, real formal power for the president and the executive, because we gotta love that legislature, gets in there, Louisiana Purchase, immediately. Oh, what's that? Your fucking principles don't comport with this thing anymore? And the thing that really mattered was expansion, because it's the economic engine of the kind of warped, capitalized, agrarian economy that you've created here, inevitably out of your idea, you fucking asshole. We do love John Quincy Adams, folks. You want to talk best presidents? He is in the conversation. Once you're past like Lincoln and FDR, spare a moment for JQA. Also one of the better men to be president. And a man who recognized he recognized that every oath in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence was going to be worth nothing over time if we made territorial expansion the undergirding mechanism of our economy. He at the moment, he's like, this is going to lead us to abandoning everything, and it did, and it has, and look where we are. And everything that everybody wants to talk about America, and all the good stuff is this schizophrenic, this Frankenstein creation of the like echoed emanations of a greater horror and a greater series of crimes and exploitations and thefts and expropriations. We weren't never made to behave the way that the European states were made to behave. They spent 1,000 years smashing against each other to grab, but god damn it, at some point you realize that there are other forces outside of you. And we never hit that because the Native Americans who resisted our expropriation of the continent never were able to cohere into a meaningful state resistance, because they started from such a lower level of surplus economy that they were not able to, because you can't do it overnight. It has to be staged, and there was no time. Especially after you have the initial massive die-off from the essentially unintentional biological warfare campaign that happened before there was even settling in North America. That had a huge impact. And then, over time, native populations were either absorbed into the greater system or were pushed out of it, but, disinherited of any land and also residue of, social formation, or institutional formation that you could turn into an actual organized resistance against another state. It was not all intentional. The first big, I believe it was the first big smallpox plague in the Mid-Atlantic, the one that happened right before John Smith showed up, the one that allowed them to even set up there, was because some Basque fishermen or something blew onto Long Island and had an interaction with local tribe and then left, and that led to something like an 80% die off of the population within a very short period of time. And so, of course, later on you have intentional, like Lord Jeffrey Amherst and his smallpox blankets. What I'm saying is that they didn't even have to try, was how lethal they were. They were like radioactive fucking berserkers. Someone asked who are their most American Americans? Because John Brown is one of our most American Americans. P.T. Barnum, another one of our most American Americans. First name that comes to mind anyway. I'll think of some more. That's a good question. I was gonna make a book of a rogues gallery of our most condensed Americans along certain axes, representations of certain, fundamental American expressions of culture. Henry Ford is another good one. Yes. Mark Twain also. Very good. Very good. For sure. Donald Trump. 100%. Joseph Smith? Yes. Yeah, no, you guys are all 100%. That's fire. Andrew Jackson, absolutely. And of course, Abraham Lincoln. L. Ron Hubbard? We got to get some women in here. I feel like we're doing it. Oh, Martin Luther King. Pamela Anderson's Canadian. Thank you very much. Phyllis Schlafly, yes. Oh. Hillary Clinton for sure. Giselle Maxwell, also British. It seems like I'm realizing that, yeah, when you talk in these terms, you're always going to end up being very hetero cis male normative, just because so much of our received, my received anyway, narrative of America is this public facing, battle of ideas in a public sphere that has been largely banned. Largely the domain of men, and white ones at that. Amber Frost, definitely. All right, I've gone about an hour here. I might have one more question. Anne Hutchison is a good one. Good way. Good way to end. Anne Hutchison. Who's going to win the World Series? The Dodgers. Finally. And it'll be with a fucking asterisk. It'll be a fake season. Who wants to win this year? I don't. I wouldn't. Good. Keep it. I don't even want it. Forget about it. Get it out of here. Get it out of my face. Bye-bye.